Hello interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. For today's video, I want to talk about something that's been concerning me more and more lately, and that's around the discourse on purity culture. Because I think accusations of a purity culture on the left are often, though not always, indicative of a much larger problem. How bad faith actors and systemic dynamics are exploiting our justifiable anger at issues and fracturing solidarity, even in spaces meant to uplift marginalized voices, and why these divisions seem to be growing worse. As someone who's been doing YouTube for many, many years now, and in that talking about trans issues a lot as we become more and more of a scapegoat, the discussion on purity culture is a criticism that I've heard a lot. For most of my time doing this work, it's often come from bad faith actors on the right who have complained about being canceled or having their free speech stifled. But more and more lately, I've noticed this discourse, over the past year or so, creeping into spaces where one wouldn't necessarily expect it, coming from people who identify as liberal or progressive or even leftists, and even within the queer community or trans community itself within different groups within that community. And quite frankly, that scares me and depresses me, and has also been deeply stressful and anxiety-inducing on a personal level, because I think it signals a really dangerous shift that we need to be talking more about. So, to get into it, the right wing has mastered the art of weaponizing narratives about purity culture in order to protect their power. They frame leftist calls for accountability in the face of their bigotry as obsessive perfectionism, painting themselves as victims of an unforgiving, cancel-happy left. It's propaganda designed to undermine movements for justice and shift attention away from the harm that they are perpetuating. What happened to the tolerant left? Why can't you let me disagree with you? This framing in particular is frustrating to me and to many activists who talk about trans issues, given how so much of our work, and my work in particular, as this anti-transness has grown, has focused on trying to understand and unpack the narratives that they use. I've spent a significant amount of my time trying to explain the mindsets of TERFs and transphobic bigots, not to excuse them or say that they're okay, but to understand why everyday people would buy into these ideologies that are being sold, these scapegoating narratives. And while those in positions of power will rarely abandon these scapegoating tactics because it benefits them to continue to do so, understanding how they're effective because they build on fears that motivate everyday people is essential to changing those people's minds, to build a different consciousness generally. But even as I focused on, fostering empathy and dialogue, the right continues to push the idea that leftists demand impossible purity, and it's exhausting to constantly defend and try to explain my humanity, while they twist that very attempt to reach out into an attack portraying trans people as overly critical or militant, and thereby dehumanizing us further. And so, over the past few years, I've had to become much clearer that this is unacceptable, and I won't tolerate it anymore. There comes a point where empathy isn't just wasted energy, it becomes actively harmful. Personally, it does depress me consistently to understand the depth of someone's dehumanization of me and try to explain to them, only to realize that kindness isn't going to reach them. And, to know that you have no choice but to fight them. But fight them I shall. It doesn't come easy to me. It's not something that comes naturally to me. I have an instinct to try to understand and reach out to others, even those who dehumanize me. But as the right wing continues to be emboldened on the gaining of political power while still stoking these narratives of transphobia and hate, I have less energy or time to extend empathy to their perspective. And I just have to flat out say, I don't respect this. I don't respect this view. That gets displayed as trans activists becoming more militant, which, frankly, they're going to do. They're fascists. They need to frame an other in their narrative and create a target for their constituency to go after. That's how fascism builds. But what's more concerning, though, is that as this sort of Overton window shifts towards normalizing and institutionalizing transphobia and political discourse, as the fascists have sort of gained more institutional power over the last election cycle, I've grown even more concerned about seeing that same "you're demanding everyone to be perfect" mentality spreading among those I should, be relying on in this moment, progressive liberals, queer community folks. And a recent example of where I saw this discourse coming up was the discourse around Representative-elect Sarah McBride. You can check out my 2 other videos that I did on that situation for my full views on the subject. But in response to those videos, I saw threads in my comments and across social media within progressive spaces accusing me and other activists who held very similar views to mine of being far left activists demanding perfection from Sarah McBride, and that it was sort of our fault for making things worse, that we were the problem. That it's trans activist fault that we're eating our own, supposedly. That I or other trans activists believe everyone must be perfect or else they're bad, and then that's sort of like creating this division, and that we're making everyone else look bad. And this criticism is frustrating, personally, to hear, because and I think a lot of other folks, never condemned McBride on a personal level as a trans person dealing with this situation. I and others critiqued McBride's response as a public official, yes, but we also expressed empathy for her situation as a trans person navigating messy political choices. My critique, at least I had hoped, was trying to be thoughtful and nuanced towards what she was dealing with, even as I personally expressed concerns and fears about her response as an elected official. McBride has, perhaps unfairly, become a symbol of trans people within the establishment political world. And with that comes both immense pressure, but also immense responsibility. And I feel it's important to acknowledge that institutional power that McBride holds. As someone who represents both her constituents and symbolically the broader trans community, something that she campaigned upon, her words and actions carry significant weight. And when she says she wants to work across the aisle in her statement with both the right and the left, even as the right increasingly shows itself to be a fascist movement that weaponizes norms and institutions to entrench their power by attacking and scapegoating marginalized communities, especially trans people, it sends a message, and that message is one of normalization, that the right's agenda is legitimate and can be negotiated with, rather than what it is, a coordinated attempt to use institutional power to harm trans people and others under the guise of civility and normalcy. For an elected official in her position, it's critical for someone in her role to unequivocally reject this normalization of far-right fascism and make it clear that it's unacceptable. That will, like the fascists have painted trans activists, be seen as uncivil and antagonistic, but to my mind, personally, I think it's necessary. Standing against those who weaponize institutions to harm marginalized groups will always be framed as disruptive because it challenges their grip on power. Yet, rejecting collaboration with oppression is not an act of antagonism, it's an act of survival and integrity, at least to my mind. McBride's approach, while well-intentioned, again, to me, my view, personally, legitimizes a dangerous political movement that exploits norms and institutional credibility to solidify its power and attack marginalized groups under the veneer of respectability. And, my critique was rooted in the belief that her response as an elected official, however complex her situation, fell short of what I thought was needed in that moment. McBride is a trans person, yes, but she's also an elected official. She, or others defending her, can't shield herself from critique by invoking her identity as a trans person. In fact, her being a trans person makes her decisions have more weight. Her decision not to directly confront institutional dehumanization holds weight as someone with institutional power and as someone who represents trans people in institutional power, something that most trans people lack. Even if politically calculated, her choice carries weight and consequences for us all. Public officials are meant to represent the people, and it's entirely valid for us to voice our reactions to their decisions. In fact, we need to be doing that. Those expressing frustration aren't the problem, they're the voices McBride should be listening to and considering in her public calculus, even if she ultimately chooses a different path. But all that said, I did recognize, and I tried to overly emphasize, that no one in her position is ever going to be perfect on all of this. There's a lot of things to calculate, a lot of different possibilities to think about. Had she chosen to disregard Republicans' rules, they would have framed her as uncivil, a concern that she obviously deemed more worthwhile to focus on, even if it showed overt respect for institutional norms that harmed trans people, including herself. I believe it's a dangerous approach, and if she had been not a trans person doing the same thing, we would have been far more willing to criticize her, but I understand why she made the political calculus that she made, even if I think it's a problem. And I also recognize that beyond her being an elected official, she is a trans person in a scary spot, a human being in this despite her job. And so her response is going to be messy. And I also made it clear that there are valid perspectives that exist that may disagree with mine. For example, some argue that McBride's decision to avoid direct confrontation was a good strategic move, citing cases like Zoe Zephyr's censure, a trans representative who faced this in state legislature, which prevented her from representing her constituents and normalizing transness in government. Even while I argued that, that was also, I think, a powerful move on Zephyr's part. Other people had a different perspective on that. And, this perspective views McBride's approach as a necessary compromise to remain in her seat, ensuring her voice and by extension the voices of her constituents continue to be heard in a hostile political environment. And while I may not fully align with this view, it is completely valid and one that I certainly understand where people come from on it. There's no single correct take here, especially when it comes to discussions within the trans community, because we are a community and not a monolith, and we deserve to be treated as full human beings, no more and certainly no less. And part of that comes recognizing that we are not one single group with all the same opinions. We're not a hive mind, as much as my Star Trek Borg-loving face would want that. I don't know what I'm saying there. I was trying to make a Star Trek joke. Didn't work. The only area where I was much less empathetic and harsh on McBride was her views on supporting Israel, but that's a whole separate discussion that I didn't really get into in the video, but I'll quick touch upon it later on in this one. But getting back to the point here, despite the effort activists and I put into approaching our critique with empathy, some people reduced the argument to purity testing, or characterized as the worst bad faith interpretation of my words, or as exactly the same as those who are dehumanizing in their anger. That framing ignored the nuance that we tried to bring to the conversation and framed us as demanding perfection from McBride. This framing shifts the narrative entirely, portraying activists as the ones wielding power and causing disruption on a national discourse level, rather than recognizing that McBride is the one that holds institutional power. It is her job as an elected official to listen to public concern and criticism and respond in the way that she wants to, but respond to the realities of the community that she represents. Yet, the burden of criticism in this discourse shifts it onto the activists voicing their legitimate concerns towards her. The McBride situation highlights a troubling pattern, how we empathize, even within the trans community, more with those of us in power navigating through tough decisions, while blaming more marginalized people for expressing frustration over choices that, regardless of the political calculus, publicly show respect for norms weaponized by fascists to dehumanize and harm those without that power. Worse, those expressing frustration often get their words framed in the worst possible light or painted with a broad brush as being no different from those who express the most vitriolic or dehumanizing rhetoric about the situation. Were there trans people and our allies who were cruel and dehumanizing towards McBride out of anger at her choices? Yes, and that is wrong, but they are not indicative of the entirety of trans people nor of leftist movements more broadly, even though they are often characterized as such. And even if they were, these individuals hold no institutional power. This is the same tactic employed by bigots like Republicans or those even like J.K. Rowling, who seizes on the worst possible behavior of those harassing her in response to her far-reaching anti-trans actions and advocacy to paint all trans people as militant and awful. The difference is that this weaponization of selective outrage is increasingly being absorbed into supposedly progressive discourses, allowing similar narratives to silence or dismiss marginalized voices within progressive spaces. And this isn't an isolated incident. It's becoming more and more a conversation over the past few years. People who claim to support trans rights often accuse those speaking up for trans issues, myself included, of constantly demanding perfection. And it's frankly exhausting. Many of us work hard to approach these discussions with understanding, to try to get into the nuance and the weeds of it, and to see where others are coming from, and to leave space for disagreements. Yet, we're often painted as radicals, even though the positions we advocate for are far from extreme. They're simply about survival, dignity, accountability, and where we hope to go next. The wonderful Jose just did a recent video on how a similar situation targeting immigrants by the right wing was put into a similar discourse by supposedly leftist organization, the Young Turks. I highly recommend go watching that video for breaking down how it happened there. Jose pointed out how the Young Turks have been doing what I've been talking about through a specific example of a story that vilified immigrants, where they equated leftists being annoying online with wielding the same level of power as politicians or institutional actors. This framing not only distorts reality, but also implies that these individuals online somehow represent the left more broadly. And folks like the Young Turks and other bad faith actors do this to stoke division to gain money or hold on to power. I personally, and I know a lot of other trans activists, do hold anti-establishment views, for sure. We're critical of Democrats for the reluctance to push back against systemic injustices, often choosing to preserve institutional norms over taking bold action to protect marginalized communities, even as we acknowledge that Republicans are the fascists and far more dangerous. But I personally, and I know many aren't advocating for violent revolution, my personal focus has been on, getting people to look at local communities and building solidarity across marginalized groups and understanding diverse perspectives in order to build coalitions across those differing perspectives. My personal goal is long-term change that challenges the status quo, but not through, right now, instant violent upheaval or antagonism, and especially not antagonism towards those who believe that the system is reformable. I see people, especially those who believe in systemic reform, as folks to talk to and persuade over time by listening to what their fears are and what their concerns are, and get them to focus less on abstract systemic change and instead realizing that what they want can be built on tangible change within their communities right now. Now, this may happen alongside or in ignorance of, or even eventually in resistance to larger governmental systems. And to do that work, we need to realize that we can't view people who are reformationists as antagonists, but shift their focus. And while my end goals may be radical, I do hope my approach is practical, empathetic, small scale, and approachable. It's about building connections, fostering solidarity, and taking incremental steps towards transformative change, not tearing each other down. And so that's why it's so frustrating to so frequently be framed as militantly purity testing, or to be characterized as the worst bad faith interpretation of my words, or as exactly the same as those who are dehumanizing in their anger. In some ways, these accusations of purity testing are a projection. When people accuse someone of being overly rigid or demanding, what they're often reacting to is how I or others are disagreeing with them and challenging their views in a way that feels uncomfortable or threatening. It's less about the actual content of our critique and more about their own discomfort with being asked to reconsider their assumptions. And it scares me, as I said, that this is furthering into progressive spaces rather than the right-wing spaces where it typically, was centered. And I think we need to understand why that shift is happening. First, I think it results from the medium and system that I and many activists, especially in the trans community, have to work within. YouTube and other social media and internet platforms often have a dehumanizing effect. While I do believe that these platforms can and have enabled wonderful, meaningful conversations, as well as been a critical tool for increasing trans representation and awareness, they're also shaped by commodification, corporatization, and algorithms designed to stoke division and anger. For trans activists, these platforms are particularly important because our community is so geographically dispersed and not a consolidated group, and social media allows us to connect, organize, and amplify our voices in ways that wouldn't be possible otherwise, but it also forces us into a system that flattens our humanity and weaponizes our visibility. And this is because these platforms are designed not to foster understanding or connection, but to maximize engagement, which translates directly for them into profit. And what drives engagement most effectively? Anger, conflict, and controversy. Algorithms are increasingly built to stoke outrage, amplifying the most divisive content because it keeps users clicking, commenting, and sharing. Yet these algorithms no longer are just exacerbating the normalized political right versus left divides, as the right has shifted further into more radical views, but are increasingly driving internal divisions within communities. And as we use these platforms for political discourse, those divisions are fragmenting within these communities. By amplifying conflict, they fragment solidarity and encourage people to see others in their community through the lens of conflict rather than connection. People aren't seeing me or other creators and activists as whole individuals. They're seeing fragments, a video thumbnail, something taken out of context, a secondhand claim by another creator or group using me for their own content, and framing it within their own good or even bad faith narratives, often more bad faith. Or they see a single tweet, skeet, or post and extrapolate it into an entire worldview based on preconceived perceptions or past experiences with me or someone like me. And these limited glimpses, shaped by algorithms and others' narratives, become the totality of how people see us. They get their own context that they start to see everything through. And that framing, intentional or not, makes it easier to dismiss us or reduce us to symbols for discourse, caricatures of what we actually believe. It stokes division by framing activists and points of views as finalized, commodified products, presenting our views as static and unchanging, rather than recognizing us as human beings with evolving ideas and desire for conversation, because the things that we put out are static products. Videos, tweets, or posts are taken as definitive, unchanging perspectives, strips of context or growth. For example, videos like this one, or the more researched Powerless essays on my main channel, are treated as though they represent my permanent worldview. But the reality for me and many activists is that we are constantly growing, learning, and reshaping our opinions based on new information, good faith critiques, or exposure to diverse perspectives. It's one of the things that I love about this platform. Many of my views have been shaped by thoughtful comments from others, as well as by deliberately engaging with perspectives I hadn't considered before. There are videos and essays that I've created that I don't even fully agree with today because I've grown since then. I can't always make a detailed follow-up to explain how or why my views have shifted since a video I made 2 years ago, or 2 weeks ago, or even 2 days ago. And while I try to signal that growth and acknowledge, when I made mistakes or where I've changed, it's not always possible to give a full account. And even when I do, not everyone notices or engages with it. And as a result, the version of me that people encounter through a specific video, tweet, or statement often gets treated as those crystallized in amber. And my views, like those of many activists, are commodified and sold as fixed and final, rather than, something to create conversations and lines of solidarity across through those conversations. And this dehumanizing process makes it easier for platforms and audiences to stoke division and conflict, turning moments of growth or nuance into opportunities for outrage. Bad faith actors exploit this antagonistic framing in order to weaponize anger over justified issues and redirect it towards the wrong target. They intentionally misrepresent the context or muddy it so thoroughly that the true source of harm is obscured, allowing them to shift the blame onto marginalized groups: immigrants, Jewish people, Arabs, trans people, and others. And it's the same tactic that right-wing groups use when scapegoating about the border crisis or gender ideology, but now framed in a different way to ostracize within progressive movements. Instead of targeting marginalized groups outright, they shift the messaging to label more progressive individuals as militantly leftist or unreasonably demanding. The Young Turks are a perfect example of this, but they're certainly not alone. And to be clear, I am not saying that I shouldn't be held accountable if I say or do something that harms others. As someone with a platform, I believe that accountability matters for all of us. But what I am saying is that I and others are often dehumanized for out-of-context points of views or reduced to a static image of, someone that we no longer are, or our points oversimplified. Increasingly, more and more often, dehumanized for views that I never held at all, essentialized into the worst possible interpretation of my words, based on just ways that it can be put into an antagonistic framing, as we talked about. To give another particularly extreme example of this that I encountered was on the day before the 2024 election, I tweeted my intent to vote for Kamala Harris out of the fear for the ongoing genocide against trans people in the United States. And yes, it is a genocide. My friend Counseling Weeks has an excellent video explaining why, what's happening to trans people meets that criteria, why it's now moved further since when she made it, but at the time was in like the early few stages of building consent for genocide and targeting and trying to find groups, and also taking trans people from parents, especially kids. Go watch the video. It goes into it much deeper. We're sadly further along in it now. But back to the point, while I was very critical of Harris and didn't see her as a path to ever any sense of full liberation for trans people, or even particularly, good for trans people, I did believe that her presidency would mitigate the existential threat of another Trump term, not just for me, but more especially for many members of the trans community who are even more vulnerable in red states and are facing the biggest brunt of this ongoing genocide. But instead of engaging with that fear and perspective that was in that tweet, my tweet was retweeted thousands of times and twisted into accusations that I was being narcissistic, self-centered, or overreacting. Some people even downplayed the attacks on trans people, framing it as a simple uptick in violence or not a genocide. And the way that this was often done was claiming that I was setting trans people against the genocide happening to Palestinians And reading those responses was, frankly, personally very crushing. I won't get into it, but like I did break down that night. But more importantly, like those responses projected a lot into my tweets, shaped by people's preconceived views of me or their own personal contexts or preconceived notions of people like me. But none of them were seeing my humanity in that moment. And to be very clear on this, people have every right to be furious about the genocide of Palestinians. I'm fucking furious too. I am frankly furious at how every single, institution of this country is perpetuating it and enabling it. In fact, I think people could stand to be a lot more fucking furious about it right now, especially since the overt outrage seems to have quieted a bit after the election when it's no longer a political football. But the situation I faced personally reflected a larger discourse that I've seen growing. The idea that trans people don't care about Palestinian genocide because we are also concerned about our own struggles right now at the same time. And to me, it's a reverse version of the racist, Islamophobic rainbow propaganda that's often used by Israel itself, which argues that queer people shouldn't support Palestinian liberation because of supposed anti-queer sentiments within the Palestinian community. Oh, they'll throw you off a roof, which is its own Islamophobic narrative. But both of these narratives weaponize marginalized identities to divide us, pitting oppressed groups focusing on their concerns against each other by framing solidarity as impossible or contradictory. That said, it's important to acknowledge that there are trans people with institutional power who use their privilege to perpetuate systems of oppression, including the Palestinian genocide. Sarah McBride, a representative who supports Zionism, is one such example of this. But this is not reflective of most trans people who remain marginalized and excluded from those systems of power and are often very vocal about supporting, actions against the Palestinian genocide. And weaponizing the actions or views of a privileged few to dismiss the broader trans community struggles or solidarity with Palestinians dehumanizes both groups, hurts both groups' causes, and erases the reality of our shared vulnerability under oppressive systems. It erases the reality that both genocides are violent and real, though they manifest very, very differently and in very, very different ways with their violence. One is targeting an oppressed indigenous population using overt, violent militant action, and the other is focused on a gender-based minority, and they're occurring in separate countries under distinct systems of power and context. And this zero-sum framing erodes solidarity, shifting focus away from the systems that cause harm and towards infighting, isolating us and making collective action much harder. Marginalized groups are pushed further apart, leaving us less able to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for each other. And platforms like YouTube and social media amplify this division, commodifying those talking about this into dehumanized products to fuel anger and conflict. And this dehumanization feeds into the perception that I and others like me to vilified caricatures. And this perception hits even harder because we're marginalized. Discussions about trans issues right now are heavily politicized. Discourse around it is often reduced to binary debates that allow little room for nuance. And these conversations are then hyper-scrutinized, frequently filtered through a lens of, purity that demands perfection from those speaking up for trans rights. It's a broader troubling shift in how trans people are perceived within navigating our own scapegoating. As right-wing hate becomes increasingly more overt and emboldened and institutionalized, even progressives, those who should be allies, are becoming more fractured and antagonistic, buying into the framing of activists demanding purity that sows division and undermines solidarity. And anger replaces dialogue. And these fractures don't stop with one person. They ripple outwards, dividing communities and isolating marginalized voices bit by bit, one vilified speaker or activist at a time. And this erosion of empathy, understanding, and solidarity is deeply, deeply dangerous. Right now, when trans people are under attack, we need more solidarity, not less. We need people to see our humanity and to recognize our fear and to stand with us, not against us. And while I've been talking about the trans community because it is my perspective and what I know more about and can speak more about, this goes for many marginalized groups, especially Palestinians at the moment. And this purity testing discourse goes further because what it eventually leads to is framing me and other trans people through these static bigotries. It becomes she's a racist, she's an anti-Semite, she's an Islamophobe, she's a far left radical, and it morphs into, she's a freak, she's a weirdo, she's one of the bad ones. Not everyone takes it that far, but some do. I've seen it happen. And this creates new boundaries of who it's deemed acceptable to stand by and for. The same tactics will be used against other trans people, other groups, just in different ways and situations. They'll be dismissed as too loud, too critical, or too radical. It will ripple out into other marginalized groups, dividing us and reinforcing the systems that harm us all. It's deeply, deeply frightening. What causes me the most existential dread right now, as we face down another Trump presidency, isn't just the Republican fascists. They are my greatest worry, my greatest fear right now, but to a degree, they're a known quantity. I understand their tactics, their language, and the violence they plan to use. What truly fills me with dread is the erosion of solidarity. The knowledge that people who, in earlier years, might have been allies who won't be there anymore. The visions stoked by this system of commodification and essentialization are breaking down our empathy and energy. And it's isolating, and that isolation is by design. This is what living in a fascist society does. Something I don't think people fully grasp. We often imagine fascist societies in a black and white. The evil fascists in power, their overt enablers, and then the oppressed masses resisting from below. But the reality is far, far more insidious. Yes, there are fascists and their enablers, but there are also people who are indifferent, who don't care. And most terrifying of all, people who, in other circumstances, might have protected or stood with the oppressed, but who under these conditions turn away. That's what this propaganda does. That erosion of care, that splintering of solidarity is the true horror of fascism. It's cutting off our hearts from each other. It isolates and divides not just communities, but individuals, leaving them alienated and vulnerable without the support they need to resist. And that, more than anything, is what keeps me awake at night. I've been deeply, deeply scared over the years for exactly that reason. I have to ask this question is when they come for me, will anyone stand up? Or will I already have been written off, seen as a villain, of someone who purity tested into oblivion, who is too evil or bad, or simply not someone worth saving? It's a really haunting thought, not just for myself, but what it says about the world we want to try and build. Will we allow the system to strip away our ability to see each other's humanity, or will we remember that solidarity, messy, imperfect, and complicated as it is the only thing that can save us? And, to end on a personal note, this fear is killing me. I've spent days having panic attacks, not just from the fear of what another Trump presidency is going to mean, but the crushing weight of seeing how I've been dehumanized as a creator, not just over the past few weeks, but over the past year or two. Now, it feels suffocating to finally realize that the emotional difficulty that I've been struggling through wasn't just the peak. It was just the start of where we're headed. I had hoped deeply to humanize myself in my work that I do on this channel and over on my main channel and elsewhere. But the way the system works, it's starting, to make that really difficult. And even more insidiously, it works its way into your own mind. I've faced these constant criticisms. And I spent countless nights thinking maybe I am a shit person. Maybe I am a far left freak. Maybe I am horrible. Maybe I do belong in the garbage. And I keep trying to hold on to the truth of who I am. Someone who makes mistakes, who does fuck up, but who is empathetic, who is trying to be kind, a nerdy weirdo who loves learning about others and trying to understand them. That's why I love science fiction. But it deeply, deeply hurts because I know that empathy often gets weaponized against me, and they get twisted against me. And I sometimes I think maybe I should just hold my heart closer to my chest. But as I said earlier, that doesn't come naturally to me, and even thinking about it is another kind of pain. And I don't want to just shut up because we have to talk about this stuff. And what scares me most is I won't get the chance to humanize myself further, to show people who I really am, because who I am is not this fucking caring about activism and stuff. I do it because I have to, but it's not what I want to focus on. I have things that I hope for and dream about, but I'm just seeing this fucking discourse. I don't know. Perhaps I'm being overly dramatic. I hope I am. I'll own my mistakes, and I'm never going to navigate all of these discourses perfectly. I fucked up Like, I think I probably could have framed some of my earlier McBride videos with more clear points on this, but like, I hate carrying the weight of ones that I didn't make, like the mistakes that I didn't make. And it's been so rough and so hard to hold all of this and carry all this fear on top of everything. So at the end, I'm going to try to keep offering up my heart to reach out even when it's hard, and keep believing that love and connection, however imperfect, can still move us closer to the world that we need. Because what we need now is a fierce, unwavering solidarity, not the kind that demands lockstep agreement on every issue while holding people accountable when they do cause harm, but one that celebrates the messy, imperfect humanity in each of us while standing resolutely against intolerance and hate. Solidarity means rejecting the forces that seek to divide us, to essentialize us, refusing to let fear or apathy flatten us into caricatures to turn us against each other. It means listening, truly listening to the voices of those fighting to survive and amplifying their truth and building bridges across our differences. This is not about perfection. It's about showing up again and again for justice, for dignity, for each other. Let us be relentless in our care, bold in our defiance of hate, and united in our belief that a better, freer world is possible. Because together, with all of our flaws and all of our strength, we can refuse to let oppression win. We can fight for a future that sees all of us as fully human and worthy of love. Let's start now.